रेडियो उड़ान की सभी अपडेट्स लेने के लिए इस चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कीजिए, इस वीडियो को ज्यादा से ज्यादा लाइक, शेयर और कमेंट कीजिए। एंड फॉर मोर इन्फो लॉग ऑन टू www.radioudaan.com।
जी हाँ दोस्तों, नमस्कार, आदाब, सत श्री अकाल। मैं दानिश महाजन बदलता दौर में आज हमारे साथ बहुत ही स्पेशल गेस्ट हैं। आज हमारे साथ वर्ल्ड ब्लाइंड यूनियन के प्रेसिडेंट हैं डॉक्टर फ्रेडरिक के श्रोडर। वर्ल्ड ब्लाइंड यूनियन रिप्रेजेंट्स एस्टिमेटेड 253 million blind and partially sighted people around the world. Dr. Fredric is an internationally recognized leader, and due to his efforts, he has brought a great change for the blind community. Dr. Fredric K. Schroeder, professionally, he is a research professor with Interwork Institute at San Diego State University. डॉक्टर फेडरिक की एफर्ट से उन्होंने इंटरनेशनल स्टैंडर्ड एस्टेब्लिश करवाए उन व्हीकल्स के लिए जो साउंड प्रोड्यूस नहीं करती थी। डॉक्टर फेडरिक ने एक बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट रोल अदा किया, चाहे वो यूनाइटेड नेशन कन्वेंशन ऑन राइट्स ऑफ पर्सन्स विद डिसेबिलिटीज़ की बात करें, जहाँ फिर हम मैराकेश ट्रीटी की बात करें। ही प्लेड अ इम्पोर्टेंट रोल। इन 1994 प्रेसिडेंट विल क्लिंटन अपॉइंटेड हिम to serve as Commissioner of Rehabilitation Administration Service। इसे हम अगर मैं गलत नहीं हूँ तो RSA कहते हैं, रिहेबिलिटेशन सर्विस एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन। तो आज हम डॉक्टर फ्रेडरिक से ढेर सारी बातें करेंगे। हम उनके प्रोस्पेक्टिव जानेंगे, ब्लाइंड कम्युनिटी के लिए आज की डेट में क्या चैलेंजेस हैं, क्या उनके लिए अचीवमेंट्स रही हैं वर्ल्ड ब्लाइंड यूनियन की पिछले 5 सालों में। तो बातचीत करेंगे और जानेंगे। डॉक्टर फ्रेडरिक, बहुत बहुत स्वागत आपका।
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So how things are there in USA?
Well, they're good. It's been very warm here in Washington D.C., but other than that, things have been good.
Okay, so tell us a little about your personal life. We want to know, how did you get blind? So your journey.
So I was born with normal sight, and when I was 7 years old, I had a very rare type of allergic reaction that ended up causing me to lose most of my sight. I still had partial sight,
yes.
And then what I had gradually decreased over the next 9 years, and so I have been totally blind since the age of 16.
When it came in your mind that you have to work for the disabled, did you ever think that you are going to be you will be becoming president of World Blind Union someday?
No, not at all. I didn't even know there was such a thing as the World Blind Union until much later. But I was very lucky when I was about 17 years old, so really not too long after I became totally blind. I got involved in a consumer organization in the United States, the National Federation of the Blind, and it's well known. It's the largest and oldest consumer organization, and it was through the National Federation of the Blind that I was really inspired to do something with my life. As I think is common when people go blind, they don't really believe they can do much of anything. And I certainly had that perspective. So I really credit the people that I met through the National Federation of the Blind for changing my beliefs and attitudes.
So we just want to understand when you started losing your sight. So what are the initial challenges were there for you? At that time, did you face any challenge in your education or in your employment right after your education? Were your parents aware of the fact that you can study?
So when I lost most of my sight, it was part of a overall serious health problem. The allergic reaction that took most of my sight actually left me very, very susceptible to infection and very weak. So I was kept out of school for 3 years. And when I did return to school, I did not go to a school for the blind. So I went to my local school, but it was at a time when there really were not services for blind children in the public schools. So I had a lot of challenges to my education, and really what happened was the teachers, they meant well, but they had no idea how to educate a blind child. And of course, I had no idea. And so anything I couldn't see well enough to do, I was simply excused from doing. So I didn't have to do any of the reading or writing or math assignments. Mostly my education was whatever I could pick up by sitting in class and listening. So that was a serious challenge, and that persisted all the way through high school. So when I started university, my education was very, very weak. And of course, that caused a lot of challenges as I tried to pursue higher education.
So now let's get back to your activism. When it came in your mind that there are a lot of challenges for the blind people and I must get in, as you earlier said, you became part of National Federation of the Blind USA. You came with your interest. How did you join this activism?
So it really started with blind people befriending me and encouraging me. And I was able, by being involved in the organization, to see that there were blind people who could live normal, productive lives. And that support system was critical. As I say, when I started university, my educational background was very weak. And yet the people I had met through the National Federation of the Blind told me not to weaken my own expectations. In other words, they said, yes, you've got these deficits in your education, but that just means you're going to have to work harder. In other words, told me, don't make excuses for yourself. Don't accept poor performance as simply the way things have to be, but work harder and do your best and assume that you will be able to finish and have a productive life.
Right. So, for the sake of new listeners, young listeners who are not aware of World Blind Union, tell us a little about World Blind Union, how it functions.
Okay. So, the World Blind Union has been in existence since 1984. So, in 1984, when the International Federation of the Blind and the World Council for the Welfare of the Blind merged, it was a merging of two very distinct aspects of the blindness system. In other words, the International Federation of the Blind represented consumer organizations, and the World Council for the Welfare of the Blind was service providers. So from the very beginning of the World Blind Union, we wanted to make sure that the voice of the individual blind consumer was really the lead voice in our work, that we work in partnership with service providers. And of course, they have a strong interest in blindness issues around the world, but we did not want the voice of the consumer to be overshadowed. So this is a core belief of ours. The things that we work on are the things that are not easy for an individual country to do. So for example, in the early 2000s, when the United Nations was considering the development of what came to be known the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, this is a UN treaty. And so while country representatives are there, this is something that needs coordination internationally if the voice of blind people was to be heard. And so the World Blind Union leadership, first through the presidency of Kiki Nordstrom, and then when her term ended, William Rowland became president, and the two of them were very involved in the development of the CRPD. More recently, we have the Marrakesh Book Treaty, and the Marrakesh Treaty was adopted in 2013. And again, this is treaties and international regulations. These are the kinds of things that you need a world body to work on. So our mission is very broad, all the way from human rights, education, employment, social integration, anything that touches the lives of blind and partially sighted people.
Right. You have put it in a right context, and this is very important, and you have simplified for our listeners. Dr. Fredric, 2-3 things from your experience. You worked very closely, and you were very keen to work over. There should be international standard for the hybrid and electric vehicles, so they could produce minimum sound, so blind people must not face any problem. So when did it came in your mind, and did you yourself face challenges with these vehicles, or you were approached?
So it was a combination of things. When it started really more with the hybrid cars, and now fully electric cars are coming along. But when the hybrid cars first came on the market, there weren't very many of them. And so for several years, I and many others were really unaware of the potential danger of these very quiet vehicles. And it was about 2010 when I got involved. Others at the national level in various countries had been concerned about the proliferation of these very quiet cars. I got involved in 2010, and part of the reason was in 2008, I was in Melbourne, Australia, and I was walking down the street, and all of a sudden a car pulling out of a driveway ran over my cane. And what was so disturbing about it, I mean, obviously having your cane run over is pretty disturbing, but what was so disturbing is even though the car was not more than half a meter in front of me, I heard absolutely nothing. It was just suddenly my cane was trapped, and then my cane was crunched. I heard the cane break, but I never heard the vehicle. So that made me very aware that these vehicles are really quite dangerous for blind people.
Right.
And really for all pedestrians. So I began representing the World Blind Union in meetings at the United Nations to try to develop a minimum sound standard for these very quiet electric and hybrid electric cars. And this gets very technical. There was a regulation issued a couple of years ago that only applies, well, I shouldn't say only, it applies to about 50 countries around the world. But the next step is what is called a global technical regulation, which functions much as a treaty. So it's a very long process through the UN, but as I say, right now there is a standard for an alert device to be on these very quiet cars, and that is binding on about 50 countries. The important thing about that is, even if you're in a country that isn't covered by that regulation, there's a good chance that the cars that are manufactured from the big manufacturing countries will have this device built in, because they are selling to countries that have this requirement. In other words, many, I would say the vast majority of these cars that are being manufactured today are equipped with the sound device, and there'd be no reason for a country to require turned off.
Absolutely right. The reason I'm asking this question, because in India nowadays there is a voice to bring electric cars, so Indian listeners or Indian advocates can be aware with this thing, which many people in India are not aware of this hybrid and electric vehicles, which does not produce any sound. Dr. Fredric, now very important question. How do you see? Do you think there is a change in attitudinal barrier? The time you started, you were a student, or the time you started losing your sight, from that time till now, do you think there is a change in attitudinal barrier, which is the most important barrier, which does not allow us to, grow. So do you think there is a change, or you think now there is a lot to do to bring a change in attitude?
Well, I think there has been a change, but I would say there still is a great deal to do. The the majority of blind adults are still unemployed. Blind people who do have work very often are underemployed, meaning that they're working in jobs far below their ability and training and education. Many parts of the world, blind children are either not educated at all or have very minimal education. So there's still a great deal to do, but the good part is that the attitudes are beginning to shift, and as as society believes more in the capacity of blind people, I believe those opportunities will increase. But I'll say this, it starts with you and me believing in ourselves. In other words, if we don't affirmatively try to change society's attitudes, if we don't affirmatively believe in our own capacity, then our lives will be devastated. And so this is why blind people coming together, working together, encouraging each other, this is really at the heart of a social movement. And gradually, through our believing in ourselves and asserting our own capacity and our own right to full participation, we can create social change and greater social understanding and acceptance. So yes, I think we're making progress, and yes, we still have a long way to go.
Right. Dr. Fredric, Marrakesh Treaty and United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities are great achievements of World Blind Union or achievements of disabled community. Now, I want to understand from you, we have a great legislation, we have a great treaty called United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability. But there are certain countries who forcefully ratifies these treaties, but in their own respective countries, they pass the act by weakening some of the provisions of United Nations Conventions on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. How do you ensure member of World Blind Union countries take care of this part, so they try to get it implemented in their country with the same provisions United Nations Conventions on Rights of Persons with Disability has?
Well, you've raised a very important point. So the UN CRPD is a treaty, and countries voluntarily ratify the treaty or join the treaty. When they do, part of that agreement is that they will modify their national laws to conform with the treaty. And as you say, some countries have done that very well, and other countries, their laws really have not been made compliant. So what do we do about that? Through the CRPD, there is a monitoring process through a group called the CRPD Committee.
Right.
And the very first step was to make sure that blind people were well represented on that CRPD monitoring committee. There would be people on that monitoring committee who understand blindness issues. The second thing we've provided a lot of training to member organizations, blind people around the world, to help them advocate first for their national legislation to truly reflect the CRPD, but secondly, if it doesn't, to use that monitoring process to bring to the attention of the CRPD committee the problems with implementation in their countries. In other words, when the CRPD committee writes a report and says to a country, you are not fulfilling your obligation under the treaty, that puts political pressure on that country to try to get it to really move in the spirit and the technical requirements of the CRPD. So again, we have to be very active. If we're in a country that has ratified the CRPD, we can't just assume that government therefore will do everything right. We have to we have to be vigilant. We have to understand how effectively to advocate and what those advocacy mechanisms are.
Right. Dr. Fredric, did you underline a problem in America? If we do study of disability history, or we find a very good thing, when it comes to the common issues of disabled, all the organization belongs to other categories of disability come together and fight for that. But in certain countries, the organizations who are working for the empowerment of disabled, different categories does not come on similar platform. So sometimes they fail to put pressure on government. How do you see that? How important it is to come on one platform for the fellow organization of all categories of persons with disability to come together and work for the common cause?
So I think what we have to, it's like what I was talking about really earlier about our own advocacy efforts, and that we can't just assume that someone else is going to take care of our needs and so on. We should collaborate with other organizations of people with disabilities when it makes sense to collaborate. So, for example, on broad civil rights legislation, non-discrimination legislation, makes perfect sense to collaborate.
Right.
But we cannot be passive and just assume that since we're working with people with other disabilities, that somehow they will know what our needs are and that our needs will be their top or, a high priority. So, I guess it's not an either or. There are times when I think it makes sense to work in collaboration with other organizations. And there are times when we have to say, no, this is a blindness-specific issue, and we're the ones to speak to it.
Right. Dr. Fredric, we want to know from you, what are the major achievements of World Blind Union in last 5 years? And the next question, what are the main challenges are there before persons with visual disabilities?
So some of these are still a work in progress. I'd say in the last 5 years, Marrakesh implementation, the first step was to try to get as many countries as possible to ratify the treaty. The next piece of that, and we're doing well on that, the next piece is to help the libraries that have the large collections figure out ways to actually share books in a way that's efficient and works for the end user. In other words, there's a lot of mechanics involved. I think one thing that I feel very strongly about, when we share books internationally, most of that will be electronic files. They won't be boxing up Braille hard copy books and shipping them around the world. Most libraries won't. It's time consuming, it's expensive, and so on. So most of it will be electronic. Well, in 2012, the World Blind Union helped organize a group that funded the development of a low-cost refreshable Braille device. And since we did that, at least one other and possibly two other low-cost refreshable Braille devices have come on the market. Now, the prices vary a little, but in broad terms, we brought the price down from roughly $5,000 US to roughly $500 US. Well, $500 is still a lot of money, but it's getting closer to the point where a child, say in a developing country, if we could find a sponsor to buy the to buy the refreshable Braille device, now that device can read those electronic files. So in other words, for $500, potentially a blind child in a poor country could have access to hundreds, even thousands of books to support that child's education as well as leisure reading. So in my mind, that is our primary achievement. It's the two parts of the sharing of the books and then also helping develop the technology that makes the delivery of those books much more affordable than they have been in the past. And we continue to work on quiet cars. We're doing work with the UN on these new autonomous or self-driving cars. we're working on what are now called smart cities, and many other things. But I think literacy and its importance to education has been our focus in the last 5+ years, and I think we've made great progress.
Right. And other part of the question was with regard to the challenges of blind people. Now,
the biggest challenge still continues to be the social attitudes, what you described earlier. If you're in a poor country and society assumes that if you're blind, you will never be able to work, you will always require care, then why would the government spend its limited resources to educate you if they don't see any long-term purpose to that education? And so part of advancing opportunities, I shouldn't say part of, I think the key to advancing opportunities continues to be trying to combat those low expectations. That's the biggest challenge. And I think we do that first, as I was describing earlier, by believing in ourselves. When I graduated from high school, I was totally blind. I had a very poor education and had very little belief in myself. And it was others who, they didn't do it for me. They couldn't do it for me, but they encouraged me. And they said, your poor education is because nobody knew how to educate you, not because you weren't capable of learning. The fact that you don't know what blind people can do for a living doesn't mean that blind people don't work. They do, and you just need to find out more about what's possible and what techniques people have used. So that I can't stress enough how intertwined the social attitudes are with first our believing in ourselves.
right, absolutely right. Dr. Fredric, a lot of people now believe disability is inaccessibility. If there is accessibility, a lot of problem goes away. So how do you see this, and what is World Blind Union is doing to make things accessible? As you earlier said, employability is very important now. Computers are there, we can work efficiently now. This technology has filled up the gap between disabled and non-disabled to extent, but a lot of websites are coming. Sometimes these websites are accessible, sometimes not accessible. As you were talking about soundless vehicles, electric or hybrid vehicles. Are you working, or are you going to work? There are standard mechanism for this web development, but people are not following. So how do you see that?
So this ties back to the CRPD. There are standards for web accessibility. The problem is getting people to take them seriously and to implement them. And that has to be done at the individual country level. And again, I think the CRPD and its requirements for equal access would be the key hook, if you will, to trying to get national parliaments to really enforce web accessibility. It's a problem everywhere, but it comes back to advocacy. We do have a committee, a technology committee, that is dealing with the big tech companies on this and other issues. There, as you say, technology is a wonderful thing, and it has opened huge opportunities. But we have to make sure that as these new technologies are developed, that we're not left behind. Something as simple as home appliances. If you go to buy an oven, many of them now have touch screens with the up and down arrow. And if you buy a microwave oven, it will have a touch screen. Even refrigerators and dishwashers. And so we have to keep pushing the manufacturers to build in accessibility. Otherwise, they're either not usable by blind people, or you have to create specialized, expensive technology to try to solve the problem one device at a time, which is very inefficient and expensive. So, again, how do we do this? We have an international committee. We circulate information. We use the connections that we have with the big tech companies in hopes that if they set the way, that others will follow. Probably the best example is the iPhone with voiceover built in. And that was hugely successful. You didn't have to buy special software. And of course now Microsoft, if you buy Microsoft products, I can't think of the name of the speech system. I think is it Narrator. I think it's now built in, and there's no additional cost. You don't have to buy a screen reader to use those Microsoft devices. So that's what we're trying to keep promoting with the big manufacturers and developers of technology.
Right. So, Dr. Fredric, you were there in India recently. So,
yes.
How was your visit, and what changes you found in India? How do you analyze our movements in India?
Oh, I had a wonderful time. I was treated very well, and the programs that I visited were doing just remarkable work. And I don't say that just to just to flatter anyone, but again, going back to this central theme, it all starts by believing in blind people. And for example, the cricket, I'm blocking on the precise name of the cricket association.
Samarthanam Trust for the Disabled, yeah.
Yes. So, I think if society, when they kind of casually hear about a cricket association, they think, well, okay, that's nice that blind people get together and socialize and so on, and maybe get some exercise. But what's more important is not just the physical exercise, but the community spirit, bringing people together. And again, that's the foundation of that network of support, where you see people who have advanced tremendously in their profession, and they're inspirational for others who perhaps wonder what the future can hold for them. But the entire visit, I saw program after program after program, each of which was rooted in a deep-seated belief in the capacity of blind people to live productive lives. And that was truly wonderful. And I will say very inspirational for me. I tend to hear about all the troubles and spend my life looking at the problems and trying to think up ways of combating some of the challenges, and to see programs that are touching tens of thousands of people's lives in a very personal and very productive way. That's really very inspirational for me.
Right. Actually, in India, Fortunately, we have very good blind leaders. We have Mr. Rongta and Mr. A.K. Mittal and Mr. Mahantesh. They are really doing well. They are really advocating for the rights of persons with disability, particularly for the blind people.
Absolutely.
Dr. Fredric, as you earlier stated, there are certain countries who are doing very well, and there are certain countries you are worried for, like whether it's with regard to the RPD or CRPD, or whether with regard to societal attitude. So, can you underline what are the countries you are worried that development is doing very, very slowly?
Well, it's linked to resources. Now, having said that, it's not a direct line. In other words, countries that have significant resources do not necessarily do a wonderful job of educating and employing blind people. But I will say that the fewer the resources, the more difficulty blind people have. And for very obvious reasons. UNESCO, the United Nations, United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, they released a study a few years ago. They said that in developing countries, 98% of children with disabilities are not in school. And so if blind children and other children with disabilities don't have that foundation of education, then of course their entire lives are impacted in a very harsh and negative way. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the solution isn't just to pour money, not that any of us has limitless money, but it's not just that if you somehow gave them more money that the problems would go away. But I would say with very limited resources, the problems are magnified. A friend of mine said that she was one of 8 children, and her siblings all were sighted. She was the only child with a disability. But her father, instead of saying he had 8 children, he would say, I have 7 children and the blind one. And, I think that speaks to this idea that, she's not, he loved her. He's her father. But in his mind, she just wasn't going to be a person who could be fully functional in life. And so, and I guess, again, what I say to that, so if you've got 8 children, and you need to figure out how to educate them or send them to school or university or provide some other opportunity, and you think of your blind child as one that will always need care, then logically you don't put the limited resources you have into helping that child progress. So, that the resources exacerbates the problem of low expectations.
Right. Dr. Fredric, we always talk about social attitude, whether it's in India or whether right now I'm, talking to you and still you are underlining that social attitudinal problems. Now the point is, we all are doing to the best of our capacity or ability to do sensitization sessions with the bureaucrats, with the general public, with the leaders, with the police. We are doing to aware people to the best of the manners one can by doing dramas, to publish stories in the media, everything, every possible thing we are doing. But change is very slow. How do you view that?
Yes. No, it is slow. And this is part of why, again, that network of blind people is so important. So when I finished my master's degree, I had a very good grade point average, good recommendations. I had trained to be a special education teacher. And at that time, there was a huge shortage of special education teachers in the U.S. And I applied for about 35 teaching jobs and received not one job offer. Now, I was in my early 20s, and that's crushing to a young person. And yet what sustained me was blind people around me who helped me understand that this was not my fault. This didn't mean that I was deficient or broken. This was social prejudice, misunderstanding that I was facing, and that this was our common and shared challenge in life. And so people who encouraged me, kept inspiring me to keep trying. And eventually, I was very fortunate. I did get a good job, and that launched my career. But as a young person in my early 20s, having only been totally blind at that time for about 5 years, this could have been devastating. This could have resulted in me giving up and going home and sitting on the couch and having my loving family care for me. For each of us to withstand that individually is almost impossible. Withstanding it together doesn't make it easy, but it makes it far more likely that we'll be able to push through.
In other words, you are saying we have to make people feel that nothing about us without us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And implicit in that is a belief that we have a right to guide our own destiny.
Right.
That we're not on this earth just to be cared for, but that we can in fact contribute.
One question with regard to the West. So there is an allegation, or you can say there is a belief in people, country like USA, since their social security system is very strong, blind people do not get jobs or do not want to get job. Do you think is a reality or myth? Number one. Second thing, as we are talking about social stigma or social problems or social attitudinal problem, what is the best way to combat in your words?
So let's start with the first. We all look to other countries, other systems for lessons, be they good ideas that have worked well or ideas that haven't worked out so well. And what I would say is any policy, any national policy, it has to be viewed within the cultural context of that individual country. So where I'm going with that is I'm going to tell you my views on how it works in the U.S., but others will have to evaluate whether the way things work in the U.S., would they work the same or differently in another country,
Right.
another culture. All right.
Right.
So I know there are people who say because of our social security system, blind people and others with disabilities are incentivized to not work. I don't believe that. I think there are some people who give up. I used my own example. When I finished my master's program and applied for 35 jobs, if I had given up and not worked, and then 10 years later you said to me, Fred, why aren't you working? Would I, just human nature, would I have said, nobody wants me? Or would I have said, hey, why do I need to work? I've got health care. I get a check from the government. Why work? But it wouldn't have really been true. It would have been giving up, not, in other words, I think most people want to be productive. And the other thing I'd say to this is, if you're on what we call supplemental security income, you're making less than $800 a month. And in the U.S., that you're living in poverty. That $800 a month in the U.S. So I live in the Washington, D.C. area. An apartment, a one-bedroom apartment in Washington, D.C., in a not the highest price neighborhood, but a reasonable neighborhood, could easily cost you $3,000 a month. So, yes, you have enough money for food, but you're not living well. Nobody says, "Oh gosh, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $800 a month if you quit your job." There aren't many people who would take you up on it. So I guess let me just say one more thing. So what would be the solution to put people in even worse poverty, to try to encourage them to work? That's not humane. So no, I really don't see the social,
Right.
I think you need a social safety net for people.
Right.
I think
right.
it's morally just.
You have put it right. You have put it in
Yeah.
right context, and this is that's why we do this interview and we ask, so bring a change in the thinking, because you are living there. You can tell us right thing, what you are feeling there, what is the exactly scenario there. The other question was on sensitization. What is the best way to combat social stigma or social issues, in your words?
It's continuous education. All right, a good example. My wife is totally blind. She's a computer programmer. And she had great difficulty finding a job. But once she found a job and actually could demonstrate her ability, then people got used to her. They didn't see her as so different. And so that changed their attitudes. Right now, as a computer programmer, she and all the other programmers, they take a week. It's about once every 2 months when they're on call. So if there's a problem in the middle of the night, they get called to fix it. So she's on call 1 week every 2 or 2.5 months. But I can tell you that every week, whoever is on call will very often call her if they come up against a problem they cannot fix. So even though she's not technically on call, and why do they do that? Because they now see her as a highly competent programmer instead of seeing her as a broken person. So it's the more if we help one blind person get out into the world, into a job and doing well, obviously that's wonderful for that person, but it also helps chip away at those low expectations.
Right. Dr. Fredric, a lot of people are now putting focus or emphasizing on inclusive education. Now, I want to understand from you whether you are a follower of inclusive education. A lot of people say that, okay, we are happy with the inclusive education, but the point is, will it be on paper only? Do we have enough resources, enough special educators? So how do you view special schools or inclusive education for the blind?
Well, you've asked, so kind of going back to the idea of whether a system works is dependent a lot on context. In an ideal world, it would be wonderful if a blind child could get up in the morning and go to his or her local school and get a good education. But as you say, that means that, first of all, the local public school has to have the equipment, the technology, the teachers. There has to be the infrastructure. I went to public school and I essentially got no education. That's not the model, clearly. I guess what I would say is some places in the world, they have the infrastructure of schools for the blind. And again, if I could get an equal education for my child in the local school or in a school for the blind, would I want to keep my child home? Of course I would. But very, very often that isn't the choice. And so as a parent, frankly, what I would want to do with my child is get my child the very best education possible. And so even if that was the heartbreak of having my child go to another town and go to a school for the blind, if that's where the educational opportunities were, that is the choice that I would want to make. And I'd say too, I have 2 children. They're grown now, but they're both sighted. My daughter, change was very hard on her. Any change of activity, it just was very difficult. My son was the opposite. He'd be in the middle of playing with something and you'd say, do you want to go do this other thing? And he's like, yeah, sure, let's go. Change was no problem for him. If they had been blind, I suspect going to a school for the blind would not have been nearly as hard on my son as it would have been on my daughter because of their personalities. And these are all things that families have to figure out for themselves. So, I always hesitate, am I for inclusive education? Well, of course, if we can make it work, but a one-size-fits-all, to me, that makes no sense.
Right. So you are saying there should be a choice.
Yes.
It is up to the parents. Options should be open for all the parents.
Yes.
Whether they. Okay. So 2 main questions now. One is on women with disability. How you are seeing development? There are a lot of incidents of sexual harassment with them. So, and on the other side, there is a great progress. Women with disabilities are doing wonders. They are also playing a crucial role in our movements. So, how you are seeing this?
So we have a women's committee, and it comes back to the same underlying principles that blind people generally are marginalized, but blind women and girls are even more marginalized around the world. And so we need to have systems that help encourage and support blind girls and women to be able to live active, productive lives. Now, the specifics of how that plays out, they range all over the place. Obviously, if you have access to some direct support that you can give children to make sure that women and girls are included. But again, like I said earlier, all of this change, it starts with us believing in ourselves. And the same is true for blind women and girls. Believing in themselves is often even harder than it is for blind boys and men. So it's something that needs to have specific attention. I will say that we were able to get the first blind woman on a UN committee dealing with women's issues. She's the first blind person to be on any UN committee that isn't specifically dealing with disabilities. In other words, it's moving us from being categorized only in the disability world to broader integration.
Right. Dr. Fredric, you were appointed by President Bill Clinton, the Commissioner of Rehabilitation Service Administration. When you got to know, what was your feelings?
It was the greatest honor of my life, was working for President Clinton. He cared about people. He cared about people very personally and very deeply. He was a very sincere man. I think he was a very competent leader. He certainly, when he came into office, our economy was in shambles, and when he left 8 years later, we had the strongest economy, certainly of my recollection. But the work that I did, I felt very supported. When I ran the Rehabilitation Services Administration, this funds employment training for not just blind people, but all people with disabilities in the U.S. And we wanted to focus on more diversity of employment, getting people not just into predictable jobs, but breaking into new fields, new occupations. We wanted to focus on wages so that we didn't just track people with disabilities into the kind of the low-skilled, low-wage jobs, but give people true career opportunities, the things that we've been talking about today that ultimately help shape society's attitudes.
Right. We have estimated numbers. Around about 1 million people were benefited out of your efforts or under your leadership. So that was a great thing when it comes from you, and we were very happy. We used to read about you. So what is the happiest moment of your life, Dr. Fredric? Some personal question now?
Well, several. The birth of my children, those were certainly highlights in my life. And they continue to be highlights in my life. I'm very blessed. My wife and I now have 2 little granddaughters, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they remind us daily of the joy of life, the importance of family, the things that really matter. In our hectic lives, it's easy to get kind of consumed by all the day-to-day challenges that we face, but at the end of the day, having that being brought back to the things that really matter, that's what brings me real joy.
What is the most touchiest moment of your life?
I'm sorry, the most what?
Touchiest emotional moment of your life.
The most emotional. Wow. In the United States, our federal law establishes a minimum hourly wage for workers, but people with disabilities are not covered by that minimum wage. And this is something, it gets very technical, but I worked on a great deal when I was Commissioner of the Rehabilitation Services Administration. But it really started by a comment a woman with intellectual disability made at a public hearing I attended. And she talked about her interests and what she wanted to do with her life. And essentially at every turn, she was channeled into sub-minimum wage employment because people looked at her and they thought, well, that's where you belong. That's just dismissing people's humanity, their ambition, their drives, their dreams. That led to major policy change in our disability system in the U.S. And it all started with really the impact of this one woman's life story that I heard. That was profound and will always be profound in my life.
What are your hobbies?
Oh, I'm pretty boring. I like to read. And what happens to me is I read a book and then that gets me interested in a topic. So, for example, I went to an event a little over a year ago in Turkey. It was a Homer festival, and we had blind people reading excerpts from the Iliad. So, of course, I thought, well, I'd better read the Iliad. And so I read the Iliad, and then I got interested in that whole time period and read then about kind of the Greek civilization and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And, it's like one book led to another. So
Yeah.
I like to read. I like to kind of learn about things that either I knew nothing about or only knew superficially.
Who is your favorite actor?
Oh, you know what? I am so boring. I haven't watched a TV show, or I watch the news. I watch all the political shows to stay up to date on policy. But I don't.
Okay.
I couldn't name an actor, to tell you the truth. I mean, I can name some, but I can't say I've ever seen them.
Okay. So, who is your role model?
So, my role model, my mentor in my life, was a man named Kenneth Jernigan. He was the president of the National Federation of the Blind in the U.S. when I joined in 1974. And he was a remarkable man, remarkable for his insight, for his ability to inspire and mobilize people to take action for themselves. He was a caring and kind person. He believed in me, and yet he was tough on me, but not in a harsh way. He was tough on me because he knew that it's too easy to sell yourself short. If a blind person says, oh, I'd like to work, but the transportation is such a problem. Maybe it's the transportation, but maybe it's the person is afraid that he or she really won't be able to do the job well. And that's what I keep coming back to with believing in ourselves individually. So he would never let me make excuses for myself. If
Right.
I was complaining one time about having too much to do, and a lot of people would have said, oh, well, you need to cut back, you need to take care of yourself, No, what he said to me is, you will have plenty of time to rest when you're dead. In other words, just get on with it. Quit complaining about it, just get it done. And some people would think, oh, gosh, that's harsh. But, it wasn't. It was, he was saying, I expect great things out of you, and get busy and do them.
What is your favorite dish?
Oh, well, again, not just because I was just in India, but I love Indian food, and so I love all the curries.
Okay.
I especially like vindaloo.
Oh, great. Who is your favorite political personality, or who is your favorite president of America?
Well, of course, I love Bill Clinton, but I also liked Barack Obama. Now, President Obama was very focused on the economy and healthcare, which are huge. but so he did not do as much in the area of disability as I would like. He didn't do anything harmful, but it wasn't as strong an emphasis as it was under President Clinton. But Barack Obama is a man of tremendous ability, moral character, really somebody that I greatly admire. So President Clinton and President Obama would be, you can gather I'm a Democrat, but those are
Right.
two individuals that I admire greatly.
Right. So, are you satisfied with the life? Are you happy with the life?
Yes, yes. I feel a great debt of gratitude for the opportunities that I've had. And those attitudes go back to gratitude to other blind people, again, who believed me, encouraged me, and also who wouldn't ever let me take the easy road out when it wasn't in my best long-term interest. And, as a result, I did get an education. I've had good employment, married, own my own home, have two wonderful children and now two wonderful grandchildren. I'm not quite ready to retire, but I'll probably retire within the next 5 years. And obviously I did my part. I worked hard, but I can't begin to say just how deeply I feel indebted to the people who believed in me.
What are the 2 or 3 things that you want to do in your life, even now?
Oh my! I'd like to find ways to systematically help young blind people grow into leadership positions. We have some wonderful blind leaders. You named 3 there in India, and I'm sure there are others. But
We have Mr. Cole. We have a lot of leaders here.
I'm sure you and yet there are many blind people who, with the right encouragement and training, could join those ranks and help expand the impact of our social movement. So leadership development, particularly among blind girls and young women, but among youth generally, blind youth, that is something, if I could ever figure out a good strategy for how to do it, that to me is a huge need that I would like to be a part of addressing.
Right. We are in the last part of interview. I have taken your too much time now. Just 5 minutes more. Like we have established disability community radio called Radio Udaan. How do you see the role of community radios across the world? That if every country has one disability community radio, they can discuss all the issues. We have first ever radio station which is run by blind people in India, and we are recognized by India Book of Record. So it's been 6 years that we are voluntarily running this project. So how do you see the role of community radios in the empowerment of blind people across the world?
I think it's very, very important. It's all part of supporting that idea of blind people as a community working together. And I mentioned how impressed I was with the cricket exhibition that I was a part of, and I, for the first time, got to try to hit a ball. I wasn't very good at it, but it was a wonderful feeling because here I was surrounded by blind people who were happy, who cared about each other, who enjoyed life, and I felt tremendously uplifted by that. But not everybody can get to this event or to that event, and so communication, creating that virtual community, is hugely important.
Right. Last question, Dr. Fredric. Media is a very important tool to bring sensitization awareness for disabled people. But unfortunately, although print media got a little bit vibrant with the issues of persons with disabilities, but electronic media still is not that vibrant or hardly picks our issues. So what is your take on it?
You saved a very difficult question for the last one. I don't think there is an answer. I think it is an issue that starts with us being aware of it and then systematically working on. And so part of it is understanding what does catch the attention of the media, and then trying to find ways of promoting our message. In other words, it's not enough to just say, we have an important message and we're being ignored. Well, okay, that may be largely true, but then what do you do about it? You know, what are effective strategies for getting more serious attention by the media and by the public at large? So I'll give you just a simple example. The National Federation of the Blind in the U.S. has been working with a toy company and just announced yesterday that starting this coming Sunday, in just 3 days, a card game called Uno will now be available with Braille. So this is a mainstream product. It's something that will be on the shelves of stores first in the U.S. and then internationally. And when people see this, they'll be interested, but it'll also send kind of the quiet message that blind people are just part of the community. I feel the same way about the labeling of medications and other products that's very common in the EU. Again, if I can take a bottle or box off a shelf and have in Braille identifying information, that's helpful to me. But as society sees that Braille, sees Braille on elevators, in other words, gets comfortable with the idea that we are not away somewhere for those people, but that we're part of society. I think all of that helps. But how we get the media to focus on our issues, that's, I think, something that, as I say, there's not an answer, and we just keep working at it.
Right, Dr. Fredric. Media always look for spicy things, and sometimes we are not. We don't want to become spices of media. Dr. Fredric, what would be your message for the society, and what would be your message for the blind people across the world?
Well, first of all, for society, just to say to people, the fact that you can't imagine how blind people do things, don't let that close your mind to the idea that blind people can do things, even if you can't quite imagine how it's done. This is really at the heart of, I think, the unemployment and underemployment. Society says, well, yeah, but, I use my vision when I do pretty much everything. And if you can't see, therefore you can't do those things. And so it's that closed mindset that I think is so damaging in people's lives. But to blind people themselves, what I would say is two things. Find other blind people and encourage them. That's not only good for the person you encourage, the newly blind person or the person who's lived with very limited opportunities, but that's good for us too. I've worked a lot in trying to expand opportunities for blind people, and I hope I've been some successful. But by doing that, by being actively engaged in helping people break free of society's low expectations, that's been really good for me and my own belief in myself. So encourage one another, take time, especially for those children, to encourage them, do our best to find ways to give them opportunities. Those are the things that I would recommend.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fredric. It was lovely talking. It was so inspiring, and I'm pretty sure we will get a lot of comments and a lot of people will be benefited out of this interview. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.